how did it end up to the place where you're living paycheck to paycheck? But I'm yearning here for a policy, for a solution, for an action.
When it comes to Brother Biden, he's got a history of broken promise.
This is true.
I had a great time. You were wonderful in the quality of your questions.
Tonight, we are joined by Dr. Cornel West, a renowned philosopher, activist, and author. Dr. West is a candidate for president as well for the 2024 election. Dr. West is a graduate of Harvard University and Princeton University. He has taught at Harvard, Yale, and the University of Paris. He's an author of 20 books, including the classic Race Matters, and more recently, Black Prophetic Fire. Dr. West is a passionate advocate for social justice and economic equality. In his music, Dr. West often blends blues, jazz, and gospel. Tonight, I'm glad to have him here to discuss his presidential campaign, philosophy, and love of music. How are you doing, Dr. West?
Oh, well, I'm very blessed to be in conversation with you, my dear brother.
So, I've been doing research on you. I heard about you for a long time, and the first question I wanted to actually ask you is it fair to describe you as a Black jazz philosopher?
That's a wonderful question, though, brother. You know how titles can be; they all fall short. Sometimes they're inadequate because reality is more complex, and sometimes they actually describe more than what's actually there. But I would say that I'm first and foremost my mama's child and daddy's kid. So I'm really a bearer of a tradition. I'm an inheritor of a heritage. I'm simply a wave in an ocean. So that if there's any title, it would have to be situating me within a larger tradition. Certainly, Black music and jazz is crucial. Certainly, being a Black man is crucial. But in the end, it'd probably be just a fallible human being trying to make sense of the world before the worms get my body, though, brother.
I mean, that does make a lot of sense. It does a lot of sense. I know that in your young childhood, you moved to Sacramento from Tulsa. That's correct, right?
Well, I was in Topeka, Kansas for a little while when my sister
Okay.
was born.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you and your family became regulars at the Shiloh Baptist Church with Reverend Cook at the helm, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I know that the parish obviously was big with rhythm and blues, and along with theology, these must have had a real significant effect on like your intellectual development. How did Reverend Cook's sermons influence not only how you think philosophically, but how you choose to communicate with the public?
Well, that's a good question. No, I think that, see, the West family with mom and dad, Irene and Clifton, and then my brother Clifton and Cynthia and Cheryl, living on the chocolate side of Sacramento, was inseparable from Shiloh Baptist Church because it was not so much, I think, the sermons, but it was more the example, or at least the sermons that I saw were more important than the sermons that I heard. That mom and dad and Willie P. Cook, they were fundamentally committed to treating people right, committed to integrity, honesty, decency, committed to what I would call moral and spiritual greatness. And moral and spiritual greatness has to do with trying to live a life of, of integrity where you're true to yourself, tied to a very deep love, very deep love, a kind of subversive love, the kind of love that doesn't make any sense in the eyes of the world. Where you embrace everybody. It reminds me a little bit of Chekhov, the absolute condemnation of no one, absolute compassion for everyone. And that's what it meant to follow a Palestinian Jew named Jesus. Willie P. Cook embodied this. He was from Brookhaven, Mississippi, grew up there. And he embodied this in the church, never took a raise, never got a new car, would never allow his building fund to be more than his prison ministry. He was fundamentally committed to serving people. And my father was the same way. Mom, very much so as well, as teacher, principal. There's the school named after her, but she would always teach Vacation Bible School in the Black community and the ghetto, teaching young kids how to read rather than going on vacation. It was that sense of genuine service, what the Greeks would call arete, the highest levels of excellence enacted through the virtues, you know?
Of course. So interesting that you brought up the Greeks. I want to like talk about that. I know the Greeks had many notions of like what it means to live like the highest level of life. How does that meld in with the Christianity that was taught at the church you grew up in? Right, they were fearistic ideas of in Greece where they were complete radical skeptics. But you're a Christian. How does that Greek ethos or telos about truth and combine with that was taught at the church?
Yeah, well, one, of course, you keep in mind that the New Testament is written in Koine Greek, so you really can't talk about the prophetic legacy of Athens without talking about Socratic and Sophoclean legacies of prophetic legacies of Jerusalem with Socratic and Sophoclean legacies of Athens. Athens and Jerusalem are always so intertwined, both
Hmm.
in my life as well as in the life so much of the West, and certainly in the life of Christians. And so there was a Socratic element that was important, which had to do with having to question yourself, examine yourself, being humble enough to acknowledge your own fallibility, your fallenness, your finitude. Now, of course, Socrates never sheds a tear, he never cries. Jesus weeps. Jesus comes out of Hebrew scripture. And
Okay.
Hebrew scripture is so much about spreading hesed, a loving kindness to orphan and widow, to the fatherless and the motherless, to the persecuted. So with Jesus, you get an existential orientation. Socrates, you have an intellectual orientation. Socrates argues and never sheds a tear. Jesus weeps, never really argues. He speaks in parables. He uses a parabolic language of stories to try to enact through example and precept rather than concept. I think they go hand in hand. I can't imagine my life without Socrates or Jesus, always dipped within the context of my own experiences on the chocolate side of Sacramento and
Hmm.
Shiloh, and later on the Black Panther Party, and a whole host of other influences. But at the core of who I am really is this child of the West household, shaped by Shiloh Baptist Church, and then open to the intellectual riches of a variety of traditions as I grow older.
I see. We'll get back to Christianity and discussing that, but beforehand, I found an interview from 2007 where you said that "What's Going On" by Marvin Gaye changed your life. You said it made me more mature in terms of trying to be responsible not only for what I think but for what I do. And interestingly, in that same interview, you said that Chuck D from Public Enemy had more of a significant political impact on you than the Last Poets or even Gil Scott Heron. How do these social and political statements connect, and how are they influencing the way that you're approaching solutions for the current, climate facing Americans in this country?
Yeah, well, when you think of the prophetic traditions, and prophecy is not about predicting the future, it's about honestly and candidly confronting the catastrophe that is that's visited upon one, and trying to allow that catastrophe never to have the last word, but allow compassion, fight back to have the last word. So that it's true. I mean, somebody like Gil Scott Heron, I mean, it
Yeah.
means so much. There's no doubt about that. Chuck D means so much. It's hard really to distinguish the impact that they had upon me. Curtis Mayfield would have even more. John
Hmm.
Coltrane would have even more. But they're part of that coterie of artists who are willing to candidly confront catastrophe and then to transfigure it artistically through language, through sound, through melody, through dissonance, through funk, to touch our souls such that that catastrophe would never have the last word. So that when it comes to musicians, especially, you see, I believe that there's a sense in which musicians are the vanguard of the species. What I mean by that is that the music cuts usually much deeper to the soul than language. You get this in Elliot's Burnt Norton, where the words slip and slide. You can't stay still. He's aspiring to something beyond language. What is beyond language? Silence, love, music, life. And music has a way of, at a very visceral level
Hmm.
trying to get us not to deny the hurt and pain and wounds and scars and bruises that are bombarding us in our lives. And every human being has to deal with wounds and scars and bruises. There's just no doubt about it. You can't make it from womb to tomb without having to come to terms with wounds and scars and bruises. And so music for me has always been not additive or ornamental. It's been constitutive and integral to who I am. It's very sad, actually, that philosophers have tended to hold music at arm's length. Remember, Plato bans the flute in the
True.
Republic.
Yeah.
He allows for the lyre, but not the flute, because the flute appeals to those non-rational dimensions of who we are, and Plato's trying to make sure that the rational
Well,
part
we
of
know
our
we know.
tripartite conception of the soul is in control, as it were.
Yeah. In many respects, growing up during the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, you experienced firsthand probably how some of your peers, who were influenced by either Malcolm X or Muhammad Ali, actually began to embrace Islam due to some people reported that dissatisfaction from Christianity. And interestingly, since 72, where I think like people reported themselves, 92% of the country was Christian, and today it's only about 64. And since COVID, churches have been closing down at an unprecedented rate. Like, what are some of the parallels that you see between the issues facing young black men today and the issues that they were facing during you time that you contended with, that you both molded and were molded by? And why are so many people living religion at the same part of it?
Oh, there's a lot there, though, brother. So many different dimensions. I mean, one, in our present moment, we live in the most commodified, commercialized, marketized culture in the history of the world. We're buying and selling, and we're being a brand and being obsessed with status, but especially tied to market sensibilities, market moralities, market religion, market education. Commodification has become ubiquitous. And so it's very, very difficult to gain access to non market values like integrity and honesty and courage and love. They all tend to be flattened out or pushed to the margins. In the 1960s,
Mhm.
we lived in a market driven culture, but it wasn't as market driven, you see, so that the Martin Kings and Fannie Lou Hamers and Malcolm X's, that in the black community, we actually had leaders, spokespersons. It was clear they were not market driven. Martin Luther King Jr. was not concerned about being the richest man. He was not concerned even about being the
Okay.
smartest man. He was concerned about being the most loving and the most courageous. Malcolm X was shot with $151 that he owned. And yet he became a towering figure and the richest man in New York in 1965, February. We don't know. And some of us don't even care. So that it was a very different kind of moment culturally and psychically. The great text by our dear brother, Christopher Lash, The Culture of Narcissism, where the market driven conceptions of ego, the market driven conceptions of selfishness, of narcissism and hedonism become more and more predominant. And it's very difficult to conceive of a life where non market values sit at the very center of it.
So you're saying that at the very center of like the church is being emptied and people losing their
Oh,
religiosity
the
is
church is commodified. Oh, yeah, church is commodified. Synagogues commodified. Uh, uh, Temples commodified. Mosques more and more commodified. It's very difficult to escape the very powerful shaping forces of commodification. It really is. And commodification tends to downplay our connection to the past, and it
hmm
tends to
hmm
foreclose the future. And the present is just a repetition of consumption, status addiction, or addiction to something that keeps us titillated and stimulated. It could be sex, it could be alcohol, it could be narrow conceptions of success, professional success, and so forth. It's a very spiritually empty way of being in the world. It's the kind of thing that T.S. Eliot saw in The Wasteland. It's the kind of thing that John Coltrane saw in Love Supreme, his great four-part rendition of his own quest for
Yeah,
God.
I was interested on how you tend to compare jazz with the knowledge of death and almost like creating life simultaneously philosophically. I've heard you talk about this in some of your interviews, and I was wondering, is it the fact that jazz is so improvisational, that's right, where like Miles Davis, where it's almost like they're consistently encountering the unknown. Is that what you mean when you talk about being able to understand death, being able to be at the place where there's nothing in order to create? Is that what you're trying to get at when you're having those
Well, there's a
conversations?
lot of different things there, my brother. I mean, one is that jazz is fundamentally about three elements. It's about catastrophe, like the blues, which means you're not going to be in denial of what's coming at you, what's overwhelming you. And then it's going to be about swing, which is a certain conception of time that allows you somehow to respond creatively. And if you're, a genius like Louis Armstrong or Ella Baker or Mary Lou Williams or Basie, then you're going to be able to respond individually and collectively with unbelievable
Mm-hmm.
style. But it's going to, yes, be improvisational, not just improvisation as a skill, but as a practical wisdom. You have to have the right timing. You have to know when the dissonant note and when the resonant note and when the melody and when the harmony, that
Yes.
sense of timing. And that's true for living as well. You need timing in life. You need practical wisdom. Again, going back to the Greeks, that wonderful moment in Antigone where Sophocles said, the only thing that we have in the face of death is phronesis, it's practical wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something to that. I think there's a lot to that, actually. But more importantly, probably more important than anything else, is that jazz is a artistic engagement with the world as one attempts to preserve one's own humanity and dignity. And humando, which is the Latin for human, means burying, that we are beings toward burial, or we're the kind of species who bury our dead, to ascribe significance to
Mm-hmm.
those individuals, now that they're no longer part of the quick, but now part of the gone or the dead. And so there's no doubt that any great human effort at trying to wrestle with what it means to be human has got to come to terms with death in all of its various forms: physical death, psychic death, social death, civic death. It's got to come to terms with forms of dogma. Every human being has certain kinds of dogma. Some
So
dogmas are
so
inescapable.
so that de-
Even
so
the
that
dogma of not having a dogma
so
is a
that de-
dogma.
so, so that death of the way in which Western society saw music, um, jazz was the death of that to bring something. It's almost like a little rebirth thing. Is what you're talking about. That's like what
And
jazz
for
symbolizes.
black people coming to terms with civic death, you're part of the larger society, but you have no rights that the mainstream need respect. That's civic death.
That's
You're
civic
part
death.
of the
Okay.
society, but you don't have a right. Spiritual death, you're taught to hate yourself. Psychic death, you're taught to disrespect yourself. What is going to be a response? Well, here comes Louis Armstrong. Here comes Duke Ellington. Ooh, you get the kind of almost artistic aristocracy, right?
Well,
Levels of sophistication,
isn't
levels of.
America at the moment of like jazz? Aren't we at the moment in the United States where we're at a opportunity where we need to have this creative rebirth? What are some of your
Absolutely,
solutions to it? What are some of your what would you
absolutely.
do when if
Well,
you make it
one
on the
is
main
that you
debate
see,
stage? What are the goals here?
I'm so deeply shaped by black music and jazz. And if it's fundamentally committed to not denying catastrophe, it means that we can't be in denial about our social catastrophe, our psychic catastrophe, our ecological catastrophe, our possible nuclear catastrophe, the catastrophe of our souls and psychic as well as society. You have
Hmm.
to muster the courage to not be in denial. And of course, that's a very American tradition too. You see, to be in denial, to be
Hmm.
innocent, to be pure, to be pristine. No, all of us are in some ways tied to the catastrophe. It's inside of us. In many ways, we're complicit. We have a certain complicity with it. But as a politician, it means you have to be free and honest and have integrity. If our politicians, my brother,
Hmm.
were one third as free as our musicians, we'd have a different kind of public life. But our
It
politicians
would
are
be
so
different for sure.
obsessed. with being, thermometers rather than thermostats. They just want to reflect the climate of opinion in order to win the next election and get the big flow of
Hmm.
cash, where the thermostat shapes it, and it shapes it by you become an agent, that you're setting the tone. You're in the vanguard. You're not just trying to follow and reflect people in that regard. That's
I
what it is to
see.
be a statesperson, as opposed to a garden variety politician.
And
Most
these
of
are
our politicians are garden variety politicians. We haven't had statesmen or
in a
stateswomen
wild
in a
time.
long time in this
Well,
society.
this is due a lot to like systemic issues, right? And the way the system perpetuates itself and how money and politics
That's
are
true.
influenced. So, interestingly, the reason why I bring that up is because, as someone who's so firmly held in their religiosity as you, Christianity as a whole was a system that was not only one of the primary tools for colonialization, it was one of the tools for erasure of indigenous people and cultures. So how do you contend with that dichotomy, with that discrepancy in your life?
Oh, I mean, one is you've got to be self critical. You've got to be honest about one's own traditions and the creative appropriation of those traditions. Now, of course, there's a radical tradition, a difference between the Christians in the lion's den and the Christians who become part of Constantine's army, part of Constantine's empire.
Hmm.
That the dominant institutional forms of Christianity after 312 AD have been thoroughly accommodating to the empire, thoroughly accommodating the structures of domination, thoroughly accommodating some of the most atrocious forms of treating persons, barbaric treatment, be it indigenous peoples, be it enslaved peoples, be it workers of all colors, be it women, be it trans, precious trans or women, and so, or gays or lesbians or what have you. You see that institutional Christianity has always been a major object of serious indictment of prophetic Christians.
How so? How so? Like it's
Oh,
like
like
institutional
Martin
religion,
Luther
for
King
example.
Jr.
Okay, but like the statement, for example, like you don't see Christianity as a historical document, right? You see it. You said you're a radical Christian. Like, do you actually believe that
Right.
God gave Moses rocks on the mountain? Is what I'm trying to ask you in this question.
Well, no. That I mean, by historical, that historical doesn't mean literal.
Okay.
That we know there's a whole. When I talked about Jesus speaking in parables, the parables are not literal, right? They're very rich stories and narratives, often quite lyrical, that provide
Hmm.
certain insights and modes of discerning how to live, how to treat people, how to relate to neighbor, and so forth and so on. But religions are always sets of stories, narratives, symbols that are trying to get people to orient their way of seeing and their way of being and their way of acting. And that's at a very, very symbolic, spiritual, psychic, existential level. That's very, very different than literality in that
Okay.
regard. And what that means then is that you're always going to have the dominant institutional forms of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and so forth. They all tend to accommodate themselves to the structures of domination in place in order to perpetuate themselves. But they also have stories, figures, examples who are critical of that accommodation, like Amos in Hebrew
Okay.
scripture, or
Okay.
like Isaiah, and let justice roll down like waters and right. He's over against the status quo in Israel. Jesus himself, what? Goes into the
Against the
temple and
status
runs
quo.
off the
Yeah.
money changers, right?
Exactly.
Absolutely, absolutely. But as we know, that human beings are going to be human beings. We're very wretched creatures. I mean, most of the history of our species, my brother, is the history of hatred and greed and envy and resentment. We're also wonderful creatures, which is to say we have the capacity to criticize it, we have the capacity to resist it, and that interplay is a kind of a conflict and clash between our wretchedness, and of
Hmm.
course, one doesn't have to be a Christian, a follower of Judaism, or anything else to talk about human wretchedness. I mean,
Of
Hegel said
course.
history is a slaughterhouse,
I mean, yeah. I
history of
mean,
wars,
dealing.
history. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
for
Gibbon
sure,
said
for sure.
it's the stories of human crimes and human follies. You're absolutely right. But it's not just, but it's very much that.
Hmm.
Absolutely. And
It
so when
reminds
we
me of
talk
a
about prophetic,
okay. When we
we're
talk
just
about
saying the
prophetic,
persons who are trying to call the dominant tendencies of the species into question.
okay, okay. It reminds me of something I heard from a professor of mine at one point, where they talked about the historicity of the story of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree. Like, there's no historical record of that ever happening, but Americans believe that literally happened. Do you find that system of creating that mythos, that symbolism, similar to the way you view what Christianity does for a people?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Because narratives are narratives. Sometimes they're national, sometimes they're religious narratives, sometimes they're scientific narratives, sometimes they're ideological narratives. Stories are stories. Now, some stories are better than others. I mean, George Washington uh, it gets credit for me for facilitating the transfer of power when he
Hmm.
could have stayed and remained the king. Well, that to
Yeah,
me is very important. It takes a certain kind of moral courage to do that. At the same time, when I talk to my indigenous brothers and sisters, and when they hear the word George Washington, what comes to their mind, and
a
tell me
murderer.
in their indigenous language, they call it towns destroyer, because his father and the others supposedly were involved in these various projects of just leveling cities. Now, what does that mean? That doesn't mean that you demonize George Washington. It doesn't mean that you reject George Washington. It means that you keep track of his wretchedness, but you also keep track of when, in fact, he exemplified a certain kind of integrity. Now, being part of a vicious destruction of vicious people is ugly. It doesn't mean that exhausts your humanity. That is
Okay.
to say, one could still be a guerrilla against the British Empire, which he was, and lead the urban guerrillas against the British Empire as the general that he was, and win the right battles in order to triumph. And I'm an anti-imperialist. So I'm with
I mean,
George when
yes,
he's
yeah,
against the British Empire, but
of
I'm also
course.
with my indigenous brothers and sisters. I'm anti-genocide.
Well,
I'm very much against George and his other when they're coming at indigenous people. So you can be that's part of what it means to be improvisational, brother. Jazz like.
jazz, like
You
being
can
able to.
move from one context to the next, and you can see the good and the bad, the wretched and the wonderful, the mountaintop and the valley.
And this is something that I think your work highlights a lot, is the ability to shift perspectives, to embody the different roles that's necessary from depending what the questions you're trying to ask. So, so with that being said, um,
Very
we
important.
we are politically at a pretty unprecedented time, right? The current front runner for the Republican ticket, Donald Trump, faces multiple indictments. And with the partisan nature of this political climate,
Yes.
Republicans have levied the same retributive investigations into Biden and his son. But Trump, on the other hand, is outclassing his opponents, right? Racking up not only seditious charges, but criminal charges. So supposedly you get onto
Yes.
hopefully the international debate stage and ultimately win presidency. How will you unify the country so government can actually deal with global issues like climate change, economic destabilization, the war in Ukraine, what's happening in China, and with the BJP in India? Like, how are you going to unify the country so we can actually deal with these existential problems that we're facing?
One, you try to bear witness to something on the predominant hatred, fear, greed, and sense of revenge. So much of American public life, not just politics,
Hmm.
given the polarization and the gangsterization of the society, is driven by this hatred and greed and fear. And uh, and you do that. Well, your first example, you see trouble, I'll call Trump brother Trump. How can your brother? Well, you see, revolutionary Christian, he's made them actions, and therefore he has a capacity, whatever wretchedness he has to change. He has a capacity to be more than his wretchedness. You see.
Okay.
Biden's brothers across the board. My brother, I haven't met you, right? Because you made an image. You have a certain dignity and sanctity like everybody else. It also means then that it allows to engage not just in a language and on the revenge, the hatred, and the fear, and even the greed. And greed is inside of all of us. Don't get me wrong. It's inside of all of us.
It's
But
inside
we
of
can
all of
push
us.
it back.
Okay.
We
Okay.
can push it back, you see.
So
The roles of education, of struggle, that you struggling internally and externally against evil and the evil. That's why we have a certain humility.
So let's say you had to deal, like, how do you toe the line? For example, let's say you have to go ahead and, I know recently in Congress there was a big issue about the way progressives were really up in arms about the way Biden welcomed in, I think it's Modi from India. How do you deal with this problem that all presidents face, which is not only interact with, like, I know you were hinting at it now, but how do you logistically go about it where you have to interact with these leaders and world powers who have done horrific things like genocide and have consistent black marks on their record, but also cooperate with
Yeah.
them to get specific goals that are necessary for the American people?
Yeah, I mean, one is that you would have both in your words as well as your deep, that one is deeply concerned about the Dalit brothers and sisters, so called, that you're concerned about the and the supremacy.
Hmm.
Because as president of the United States, you're not concerned solely with your national security and the issues affecting your citizens, but you're also a moral and spiritual being, and you're concerned about the suffering around. Somebody came in from South Africa, and then you got a form of white supremacy that is so barbaric and vicious. That doesn't mean you can't have a conversation with them. You're just being
Hmm.
upfront as to where you're coming from. Now, I myself, I wouldn't have a huge
Oh, Brother West, I think you're freezing up a little bit.
carpet
Okay.
someone who facilitated such oppressive policies. But I do believe in speaking to one's foes, speaking to ones that one has deep disagreements with, but being very honest about where you're coming from. You don't dampen
Hmm.
your own fire to get some kind of red. No, no, I'm very different than Brother Biden in that sense.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you a question that's a little controversial, but I want to take your take. I want to hear what you have to say about it. Recently, you were a little bit embroiled in a little controversy while you were on
Sure, sure.
Fox. I think Laura Ingram asked about a recent article from the Daily Beast, which claimed you owed like $500,000 in unpaid taxes, and then you tweeted in response that you're dealing with this issue. I think you said, "I have been facing heavy financial responsibilities to families and friends. The waves of IRS audits, fees, liability leaves, and liens have always been and are now resolved based on agreements set in place years ago." But the thing I want to talk about is you said, "I live paycheck to paycheck with dignity and determination." How did that happen? Because you're a distinguished professor, you worked at Harvard, Yale University, you've authored over 20 books. How did it end up to the place where you're living paycheck to paycheck?
Well, I mean, part of it is, my brother, I never really got out of the hole with heavy student down. Money never really you get, but liabilities and the fees the year are such really been obligated
Yeah,
commitment to things.
Dr. West,
But
you're
no,
lagging a little bit. We can't.
to
I
me
actually just I actually just missed you for the last two and
it's
a
not
half
as
minutes.
inconceivable as you think.
Hmm. It's not as inconceivable as I think.
Really,
Yeah, you're a little lagging again. So if you could repeat like a minute of that, maybe let's see if everything's okay.
right? No, what I was saying.
We're of course having some technical
Okay,
difficulties. You can't
it
help
was a
the
matter
internet.
of. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
You're falling behind early on, and with fees and liabilities accruing, never being able about making it as a way from money. That's it, like that.
We're having a really hard time hearing you right now.
Is it freezing?
Yeah, you're freezing up for me. Yeah, yeah. Let's take a second to try to fix it. Maybe move the computer a little bit. I'm not really sure what's exactly happening. Um,
I
this is
think we both were actually
no. I really can't hear you. Keep lagging in and out for me. Everything was working perfect.
moving it off. Continue on my
It could
wife's
be the
thing.
device he was on. So let's
Sometimes
see
that
what happens
happens.
here.
Sometimes
Okay.
that happens.
Definitely, but
Yeah.
I appreciate your patience because I must say, man, you've been very good in this interview, the quality of questions and
Oh,
the
thank you. I tried.
very much so.
I mean, I myself, I study psychology. I concentrated in philosophy, and I find everything you have to say extremely interesting and prescient. Uh, uh, I know, I know. The last question, we'll get back to it, but I just want to really say that I really value your perspectivism in your philosophy and the way you're able to really recognize that truth is stance dependent as opposed to a thing that we're just going to grab out in the universe. And I just want to tell you that I appreciate that wholeheartedly.
No, absolutely, absolute. But as I said before, so much of it has to do with our human finitude. You know what I mean? That
Hmm.
we're cracked vessels, though, brother. That we have deficiencies and defects, and that doesn't mean we don't have dignity. It doesn't mean we
Of
don't have
course.
unbelievable possibility and potential. But once you accept your finitude, then things are very different. I mean, this is why somebody like a Montaigne makes a big difference. This is why someone like a Chekhov makes a big difference. Somebody like a Toni Morrison, because it means then, that wonderful letter that Robert Louis Stevenson wrote, that Henry James wrote to Robert Louis Stevenson. No theory is kind to us that cheats us of seeing,
Hmm.
and no one has a theory that sees everything.
Okay, I like
Every
that.
lens,
I like
every
that.
lens has has splinters. Uh, every eye has a certain mote in it, and given that, then right back to jazz again, though,
Of
brother.
course.
You got to find your voice, right? You're not
Hmm.
gonna just be an echo of a silo and just going with the crowd, but you got to find your voice. But when you find your voice, it's still going to have its limitations. It's still going to have its shortcomings. It's still going to have its blindnesses because that's what it is to be human. We always, in some ways, look through a glass darkly to invoke the biblical text that Paul himself was a Jewish brother, Roman citizen,
Hmm.
who underwent deep conversion and transformation, as you know it. Instead of being someone who was persecuting Christians, he becomes a great leader of the church. But he would be one of the first to say, I always see through a glass darkly. Well, you see, I like that sensibility. I like that sensibility.
Okay.
And it means then, and of course this is true for modern science, that we take very seriously what the physicists have to say and what the biologists have to say. But it's always within the spirit of self-criticism because they know
Yeah.
they don't have a monopoly on truth, capital T
Correct.
either.
And this is
They
why
predict very
I
well. They've
think
got theories that predict marvelously, but that doesn't
amazingly,
mean
amazingly.
it's always true. It just means that they predict well, but we have to take them very seriously. But they have to take we religious folk and we artists very seriously because they know they have to deal with death, dread, despair, disappointment, friendship, betrayal, and all of those phenomena that have to do with their humanity, not just their role as scientists.
Of course. I wanted to go back to the question that we just could not hear a response to.
Oh,
And I
yes, yes.
yeah, about how did it happen? Obviously you're a flawed person and obviously, people have issues and
Absolutely.
you said liens and things kind of caught up with you. Um is this something that you think Americans should be concerned with? Like how would you talk to a voter about this issue if this was something where they said, I don't know if I can trust someone who's in this position running for office and this has happened to them. Like shouldn't yeah, what would be your answer to someone like that?
Now, I think voters would be much more concerned about looking at my record regarding my commitment to their welfare, my commitment to having their basic needs satisfied. I think they'd be much more concerned about my strong defense of Medicare for all, and quality education, my strong defense of workers ensuring that they have living wages and so forth. I think those are the kind of issues where you have to look at candidates and see what their record is. Now, if they think that, well, for me to be committed to their welfare, as well as acknowledging that I've never been that preoccupied with money and so forth. I don't think that would get in the way of my commitment to them. Not at all.
I see.
Not at all.
Okay. I wanted to ask you about, because we talked about no capital T truth, and I wanted to explore the philosophy a little bit more. Pragmatists very much say, kind of, like you said, a radical thing. They kind of throw away Descartes' whole project of trying to raise a foundation and create something by all knowledge could be built.
That's right.
How does someone like you in your position, who's going to talk, I think you're 4% in the polls right now. How do you distill that message to Americans that we shouldn't be as preoccupied with that which is true, but rather should be preoccupied with our perspective as a country and working with one another for truth? How do you do that politically? Is really what I'm trying to get at.
I think that, you see, with Descartes, he was obsessed with indubitability, that which is beyond doubt. Mm-hmm. And he was obsessed with certainty. Now, indubitability and certainty can too easily take the form of narrow dogmatic dispositions. Mm-hmm. One has the truth. One is certain that one has the truth. It's beyond doubt that one has the truth. And then you're on the road to authoritarianism. Mm-hmm. That democracy is about the experimental. Okay. Democracy is about proceeding in an improvisational way. Jazz, in a certain sense, is symbolic democratic action, right? Because you're lifting your voices in an experimental way. Nobody's trying to dominate. Nobody's acting as if they've got the full truth and others have no truth whatsoever. But you do recognize it's certain, Louis Armstrong is much better than a lot of the other folk blowing the trumpet. I mean, you got a hierarchy of excellence that's inescapable. But I think in the end, it's a matter of ensuring that fellow citizens know that there are leaders who are fundamentally committed to the best inside of them and are critical of the worst inside of them. Just as the leader has the best inside of him or her and the worst inside of him or her. So if you criticize me, I got to listen very closely. I've got limitations. I can learn. Then I respond critically. You've got limitations. You can learn, but that's dialogue, democracy. That's what it's all about. But our problem is, my brother.
What's our problem, Doctor?
Our problem is we've got massive disrespect and we've got despair in terms of people giving up, in terms of participating at all. I mean, what is it? 40-some% of our fellow citizens don't vote at all.
No, they don't.
Participate in the system at all.
And only about 9% to 2% in local elections to begin with. That's also a massive problem.
That's exactly right. So they just look, oh, no, this big money is taking over. These politicians are nothing but extensions of money and extensions of various constituencies. They won't take a stand on their own. They're obsessed with the next election. They're obsessed with the next interview on television. Where are the Abe Lincolns? Where are the Martin Kings? Where are the Fannie Lou Hamers, the persons who exemplify integrity, honesty, decency, willing to be unpopular in the name of integrity and trying to make integrity more popular?
But couldn't a criticism be levied against you that you are trying within the system to run for president to reshape the system? So how do you contend with that? That while you're saying, well, it's all these people who are working within the system, really perpetuating it, but you're kind of like doing the same thing, are you not?
No, that's true, because all of us are betwixt and between. I believe in an inside-outside strategy. I've been inside of the academy for many years, but critical of the academy.
Okay.
I've been inside the church, very, very critical of the church. Mm-hmm. I've been inside movements, very, very critical of movements, right? Because I always preserve my freedom to think critically for myself, to think against the grain. But I want to do all that I can to make sure that save the planet. Ecological catastrophe is very real. Fossil fuel companies need serious, not just regulation, but transformation and oversight, and a move toward renewable and regenerative energies. I'm concerned about the wealth gap and the greed at the top. We need a massive, massive transfer of wealth from the well-to-do to poor and working people. We don't need to have the levels of poverty and levels of homelessness and unhousedness in our cities and towns, in the richest nation in the history of the world. And people say, well, Brother West, that sounds like revolution. Well, revolution is a sharing of power. It is a sharing of resources. It is a sharing of dignity. And when workers are able to gain access to some of the high profits, that's a sharing of resources. And there's no accident that the trade union movement and its fights for living wages were viewed as revolutionaries by the owners of factories and the owners of big property. Same is true with women. Against patriarchy, where we want to share resources and dignity. We don't have to live in this hierarchical situation in which women are confined. Well, we needed a transformation. We needed a certain kind of revolution vis-a-vis patriarchal institutions and so on. And I agree with that. And certainly it's true in regard to white supremacy.
But the same is also true of the way in which voters are disenfranchised, right? So, like, what is your stance, or like, what are some of the laws or things that you would push for to kind of stop gerrymandering and stopping the splitting and packing of predominantly black districts in this country that has really disenfranchised the black voice in this country once again? Even like, we expected after the civil, I mean, Americans, a lot of Americans expected after the civil rights movement, or even how they're taught it in schools, very whitewashed version of history. Well, in the background throughout the 90s and early 2000s and even now, gerrymandering once again has disenfranchised minority votes in this country. How do you go about dealing with that if the mechanism by which these people exercise their vote is the system that is stopping them from voting to begin with?
Yeah, a lot of that has to do, though, brother, with the narrow two-party system that we've for too long been locked into, the corporate duopoly. The parties going at each other, trying to engage in gerrymandering in order to reproduce themselves at the top. If we had ranked choice voting, if we abolished electoral college, if we had proportional representation, there would be more choices that people would have, and therefore there would be more forms of accountability of the two parties that are involved in the gerrymandering.
Mm-hmm.
What has happened at the moment is that both parties are so tied to big money, tied to big military expansion. You got bipartisanship on relation to Wall Street, relation to Silicon Valley, relation to big money, and in relation to military adventurism abroad. You can get Democrats and Republicans, they agree on that wholeheartedly, as much
Of
as they
course.
claim to be at each other's throats.
Just like Democrats agree on Israel. They just, when you look at the ballot, it's checks all the way down. Yeah. So
that's exactly right. You say, I say, well, see, gerrymandering is one particular manifestation of the very ugly consequences of our two-party system. So you get the Machiavellian response to each other, knowing that nobody else is there to keep either one accountable.
Okay. So, but with the military-industrial complex, while I love everything you said, how do we deal with what's happening in Ukraine and with Putin, right? At the same time, you want to weaken that part of the country, but we recognize Ukraine's invasion is illegitimate. We recognize the sovereignty of the Ukrainian people. And how do we go about supporting that without perpetuating this military-industrial complex?
Yeah, I mean, I always begin with solidarity for the people who are suffering, which is our Ukrainian brothers and sisters. There's no doubt about that. The invasion was criminal. It's not just wrong, not just immoral and illegal, it was criminal. At the same time, there's background conditions that are in place, you see. And there's no doubt in my mind that when Russia was promised that NATO would not move 1 inch, they took it seriously in the early 90s. And a few decades later, former Soviet countries are part of NATO. Next wave, getting closer and closer. And of course, Ukraine has what, 2,000-kilometer border with Russia. Well, Russia is an empire. It's a wounded empire. American empire is the most powerful empire in the history of the world, militarily and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But Russia is a wounded empire. Still has nuclear warheads, but very wounded. But there's no empire that we know in human history that's going to allow another empire to have 2,000 kilometers on their border and view them as not just friends and allies, but you can have missiles in Poland, missiles in Romania already. And there's no doubt in my mind, if Russia had missiles in Mexico and Canada, what would be the response of Washington? what would be the response of either Democrats or Republicans?
Yeah.
They'd probably blow them to smithereens in a second because it's too close. It's too close. It's provocation.
So
You're pushing against the wall, you see.
just to understand correctly, you're not saying, or are you saying that Ukraine should have not had the option to democratically decide to join NATO?
I'm saying that the national sovereignty of Ukraine is in fact precious. There's no doubt about it. And the violation of that sovereignty by the criminal invasion was wrong.
Okay.
But I'm also saying that if in fact we had I would have abolished NATO. We don't need NATO after the Cold War, you see. So that you can have a variety of different security systems within Europe operating. But because NATO continued to expand and expand and expand, the Ukrainians became subject to criminal invasion because criminal invasion is the way empires respond when they have their backs against the wall. And the expansion of NATO was a fundamental factor, not the only one, but a fundamental factor that pushed Russia against the wall.
Okay, so how do you then deal with the we get the words about, how do you then deal with the issue of making sure to have some sort of alliance group to make sure that we don't have these wars brewing again, that we saw the catastrophes from nation states and nationalism that we dealt with in the 30s and 40s, which is having a neo-fascistic return.
Right.
What would be the implementation if NATO is gone? What do we need to have in place to make sure that these wars don't break out again?
Oh, well, Europe itself, they've got some creative leaders who come up with ways in which they can have their own security. Europe itself, they still have nations or 2 or 3, 4% of their budget has to do with military presence. And of course, France and others have nuclear weapons too. So it's not like you're dealing with slouches here. But keep in mind, in the early 90s, Russia really wanted to become part of the community of nations in which they would become part of Europe.
Okay.
You see what I mean? We missed that moment. We missed that moment, you see.
So how do we go about it then? Like, what is an action that you're saying this is how we go about it, right? Because philosophically, I think your mind is brilliant, but I'm yearning here for a policy, for a solution, for an action.
Well, one, when it comes to the war, we would have to engage in a wholesale diplomatic process in which Russian troops leave, in which Russia is told that they would not be provoked in terms of having any nation on its border having U.S. missiles or having intimate relations with the U.S. empire such that they feel that they'd be attacked, that their security is a factor, just like the security of any other nation or empire is a factor. At the same time, I'm deeply concerned about what the land situation would look like because I don't believe that the land that the Russian troops have taken over should remain under Russian authority, but that would be part and parcel of the process.
Okay.
But we've got to stop the war because the war is escalating all the time and it's headed toward nuclear exchange. And at that point, it's clear that it's Russia versus America. And Ukraine ends up being the proxy in that context because any attack of any NATO country is an attack on America. So if it spills over to any NATO country, United States will respond. And that response is going to be nasty, just like Putin's nasty. And so you got the gangsters on both sides here. This is very important to keep in mind. And you know, and I know that when it comes to invasion and occupation of nations, the United States has no moral authority in that regard, given all the invasions and occupations. Of course,
yeah. The United States couldn't care less.
We've involved in Iraq. We can go on Iran in 1953, and Guatemala, and Brazil, and Dominican Republic, and Grenada, and Panama. We can go on and on and on, and we haven't even got to Africa yet. So that the question becomes, well, realistically, what kind of policy? Sit down and bring the leaders together and bring the suffering to a close and try to come up with some fair and just diplomatic process to sustain the peace.
I have two more questions for you, and then we're
Oh,
gonna
sure,
we're gonna let
sure,
you go.
sure.
The second
Uh-huh.
one would be I recently saw an article about the financial growth and investability in Mexico. For a long time, me and my friends who are a part of the New York State Legislature, and we're here. I grew up in New York, and I'm politically active. We have talked about
Yeah,
how the United States abandoned its southern border for investment in Indonesia and China. And we saw that under Trump's regime, China was able to go ahead and do a lot of messy things in South America and in Africa, you know, extending their grasp. What would be some of your plans about how to reinvigorate South American and Latin economies? That way, our continent as a whole can be financially and economically stable.
there is no doubt in my mind that if the United States acted as a dignified and decent nation vis-a-vis Central America, Latin America, this countries in this hemisphere below, Canada is a very different situation. But if we acted as a decent nation concerned about the plight and predicament of their poor and working people, we'd have less problems at the border because people are fleeing owing to the overwhelming violence, poverty, shattered families, looking for a way out in the name of safety and some prosperity. But unfortunately, our corporate policies and priorities in Mexico, Central America, and Latin America has been such that we've never really shown a deep concern for the poor and working peoples of Central America and
You
Latin
haven't.
America. We just haven't. We just haven't. That our foreign policy has been one of corporate interests, and when the need was there, invasion and occupation. It could be Haiti, it could be Guatemala, and so that would be one of the first things, and it would be so alien to the to Latin Americans to have American president that would look on the world in that way. They couldn't. It would be almost unbelievable. You mean to tell me that this is not primarily about the oligopolies and the monopolies that played a role to suck out the profits of our country and go back home and live lives of luxury? No, I'm fundamentally concerned about the poor and working people in Brazil, poor and working people in Mexico, poor and working people among all of the various countries. It's a very different orientation. And what does that mean? That means we're talking about dismantling the U.S. empire. We're talking about unleashing democracy, empowering working people around the world, and we're talking about saving the planet.
Okay.
That's what this campaign is, a moment in a movement that is both domestic and international, that is fundamentally committed to poor and working people.
I've seen people online talk about how, because realistically speaking, your chances of winning the presidency are relatively low compared to you don't have the big donors behind you that most politicians,
That's
right?
true.
Right. But they do
But
say that.
chances are low at the moment. And of course, you're right. We do not have the money. I mean, you should know labels got 50 million in a month.
Of
Trump
course.
7 million in one
Yeah,
day.
yeah.
That's not enough. We are a poor and working people's campaign for poor and working people. That's right.
But my point is that I've seen people say something along the lines of, at what point do you say, okay, I recognize that my percentage is high enough to scare Biden. Maybe I go talk to him. Maybe I go, hey, I'll drop out, but if you promise this, this, and this, or if you go out and start talking about this in your campaign, I'll go down and support you. Do you think that's a valued strategy? Is that something you're considering at all?
I mean, when it comes to Brother Biden, he's got a history of broken promises.
This is true.
He just does. I mean, I don't have the trust. I wish we had evidence that would lead us to justify the trust. But secondly, this is an attempt to ensure that the fascism that people are rightly fearful of does not take root, because there is an alternative, and the Democratic Party is beyond redemption. It does not have the capacity to provide an alternative vision and passion that would fight back fascism. So if we don't do it now, sooner or later the fascists are going to triumph anyway because of the two-party system itself being so impoverished in terms of providing alternatives. So that what this campaign is about in part is trying to create alternative visions, alternative infrastructures, alternative institutions, and alternative ways of being that can provide a genuine alternative to the fascism which is on its way. And Biden and Democratic Party, for the most part, will be caretakers. They'll be postponers of the fascism of the Republican Party hijacked by Trump or any other neo-fascist. And this is not to say that the followers of Trump are all fascists. That's not true. He has a heterogeneous, diverse base. 1 out of 8 of them voted for my dear brother Bernie Sanders. 1 out of 12 voted for Barack Obama. They're just so desperate. They're so frustrated because they know the Democratic Party is not able to deliver, and the only alternative available is the neo-fascist Pied Piper, Brother Trump himself. And I'm saying, there is another way. Mm-hmm. Not to break from the two-party system. You're going to have to, we need a rupture. We need an interruption. We need an eruption. That's what democracy traditionally has always been.
Okay. And the last final question is very simple. What would you see or foresee that's going to happen in this country if Trump wins and pardons himself or begins that change? What do you see as because do you see that as a greater threat than Democrats? And what do you see as the outcome of that if that ever happens?
Well, you never know. I mean, history is unpredictable, oh brother. I come from a people been enslaved in the name of the Constitution for 75 years. Mm-hmm. And then under neo-slavery for another 100 years. You know what I mean? And we generated our resistance. We generated our resilience. We loved our children. We sustained our family and our churches and our mosques and synagogues on the chocolate sides of town. We just don't know. There's no doubt that it would lead toward a wholesale delegitimation of the U.S. presidency and of the U.S. government. And it would probably facilitate possibly a second civil war. Who knows? Mm-hmm. I don't know.
I hear you.
We just don't know.
We actually just got a super chat in, so if you have time for one more question, I'll love to shoot it your way. Sure. It's from Joshua Smith, and he said, thoughts on Obama and his handling of the 2008 crash. Was he naive, ignorant, or a foolish establishment neoliberal for the bailout?
My dear brother Barack Obama was thoroughly captive to Wall Street. He had the meeting in March of 2009 where he brought a cake and he told them, I stand between you and the pitchforks, but I'm going to protect you. Don't you worry. You have nothing to have any anxiety about. He made it very clear with Tim Geithner and Lawrence Summers and others who themselves were extension of Wall Street interests that all of the criminality on Wall Street, the insider trading and market manipulation, the fraudulent activities, the predatory lending, not one would go to jail. So much for rule of law. So much for law and order.
So in the same way, the same corrupt politicians also got to be put into jail. All of these indictments need to be followed through.
If they get a fair trial and if that accountability kicks in, you are absolutely right. Same as Trump, same with anybody else. Who knows where these criminal investigations will lead vis-a-vis Biden? I mean, the corruption, as we know, is widespread in both parties. Yeah. And it's the sign of an empire in decline. Most of the great empires suffered from military overreach. We got 800 military units around the world. 57 cents for every dollar goes to the military. So we got expansion of the military. We got austerity at home. Citizens more and more feeling corrupt. Pied Pipers emerging, scapegoating the most vulnerable, not confronting the most powerful. And then you have, and the worst thing is, the distrust and the despair. You see? So, because that distrust and despair leaves people open to fascist alternatives. All we want is order, even if it's a tyrant.
And they're willing to go for the great king. Order. They're willing to. Have you read Spangler by any chance that you're speaking about stuff like this?
Absolutely. Oh, the decline of the West.
Yeah. But that book a lot of times is also used by fascists and was used by fascists to justify fascism.
That's true. It cuts both ways.
It cuts both ways. Would you say Spangler is jazz then?
A jazz man?
No, I'm just making a joke. Like
No,
Spangler's like jazz,
no,
it cuts
no,
both
no.
ways.
Spangler is he's nostalgic, but he still has some very deep truths to put forward. See, jazz is very American, which is like Gatsby's Green Light. Remember that next to last paragraph of that great American novel, the Great Gatsby. Gatsby believed in the green light. What is the green light in that novel? Tomorrow will be better. Tomorrow will be grander. Tomorrow will make our breakthrough. America has always been obsessed with the future and almost ascribed metaphysical status to futurity, as John Dewey says. That's why we're concerned about consequences and results rather than grounds and bases of the past. And we need past and future, but America's fascism is always going to be highly futuristic, so that the greatness that Trump talks about is in our future, even though it's nostalgic because he wants to go back to 1950s.
But it's always in our future. Do you think that's because America has the history is of a peoples who have escaped their homelands, as opposed to, I mean, they escaped their homelands, destroyed a homeland, but they don't have a history, right? When you look at Europe, right, they have the Vatican, they have century. Like, I grew up in Israel, we had Jerusalem that's been there for 3,000 years, but here in the United States, our monuments are only 200 years old. So how do
No,
fascists deal with
that's
that?
part of it. No, that's part of it. That's part of it. But keep in mind, my brother, that you and I and every other precious human being, we all have histories and traditions and past.
Okay.
You can bring the Irish brothers and sisters and drop them off in Boston. They have a They have a history. They have a past. It's just that in the new land, they feel far removed from that past. But that past is still operating in the present in terms of their grandmamas and granddaddies still having impact on them. And in terms of the Irish history being retold at home and so forth and so on. But it's this sense that the future is something that is always going to be positive. That's American. That's what F. Scott Fitzgerald's talking about in The Great Gatsby. Now, see, that's not true for Russians. That's not true for Chekhov. It's not true for Dostoevsky. It's not true for Tolstoy. Because for them, they can't even conceive of a future that is necessarily going to be positive, because they seem to recycling over and over and over again. Whereas America's this sense of being on automatic progress is built into our project.
I see.
You
In
see
the
what I
same
mean?
way, it's almost as if America itself embodies capital and capitalism, and an economy that just must grow, and that's all we see all the time.
I mean, that's the economic side of it, but the American culture is not reducible just to the market, though.
Yeah,
There
of course,
is
of course.
something about the utopian energy of beginning anew, starting all over again. Everybody has a past. Jefferson's got a past. Washington's got a past. Thomas Paine had just got here a year and a half and wrote Common Sense, and he becomes the hero of the revolution. He is as English as I am black man. But he had a past, but we're starting anew. Now that's different. Ooh, that's very different. And that newness becomes locked into an obsession with the future. I do believe that the future is unfinished and incomplete, but I don't fetishize the future. I don't ascribe magical power to it. The future can be just as ugly as the past, and the past has something that's beautiful in it. Your great 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 grandmothers and my great great grandmama, they some beautiful creatures. We never got a chance to meet them, but they some beautiful creatures more than likely, and that's part
I
of
know
the
what you mean. I
past.
know what you mean. Yeah.
That's part of the past. But it depends on what we do. It depends on how we act. It depends on our integrity, honesty, decency, courage, and willingness to be self-critical and still have a smile and have a little fun before the worms get our bodies, brother.
Amazing. Dr. West, thank you so much for coming onto the show. I had a pleasure talking with you. You're always welcome to come again. I had a great time talking. We could talk about many different
And I
topics.
had a great time. You were wonderful in the quality of your questions, my
Thank
brother.
you. Thank you. Thank you.
No, I'm
Thank you.
serious about that. You take good care, though, man. Stay
Take
strong.
care. Keep thinking. And yeah, good luck. Guys, that was fantastic. Thank you, Dr. West. You were absolutely amazing. And we hope to see you again.